webinar, Conscience, Taxes for Peace Not War. And the second one is on conscientious objection during the Second World War. My name's Karen, for those who don't know me, Karen Robinson, and I'm the campaign worker, Conscience. And for those who don't know us, we're a peace organisation campaigning for a change in the law so that individuals can opt for the military part of their taxes to go to peaceful purposes instead. So we exist to campaign to change the law, and you may know that the right to conscientiously object to serving in the military was achieved in the UK in 1916. So there's no physical conscription in the UK today. We're not conscripted into the army for physical military service. However, we are each forced to pay for the military through our taxes. The conscience campaigns that individuals have the right to conscientiously object to this modern day financial conscription. And the webinar today is part of a series of conscience webinars called Voices of Conscientious Objection. And we're really grateful to have received a grant towards these webinars from Funding for Social Change. We had the first one in August, and we were delighted that Simon Hill from the Peace Pledge Union could come and speak to us and introduce the series. And this is our second one. A little bit about the programme for this evening. So yes, I'm here, I'm Karen, introducing the webinar. And our first guest speaker is going to be Donald Saunders. It's very exciting to hear about, and sobering to hear about his experiences as a conscientious objector during the Second World War. So we're delighted that Donald joined us from North Wales. Thank you. And then there's plenty of time, plenty of opportunity to ask questions and comments in the chat section at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So we'll then have a time for any questions or discussion that people would like to have after Donald's talk, and Jonathan will be facilitating that part. And then we're very lucky to have Ann Kramer with us as our second guest speaker. Ann's a historian and writer, and I'm sure she'll tell you a little bit about her book that she wrote and the interviews she had with conscientious objectors during the Second World War. So welcome, Anne, I think from Hastings. And then similarly, there'll be a time for questions for Anne, facilitated by Jonathan. And then I'll come back at the end and just tell you a little bit about our next webinar. So yes, do feel free to join in the chat section at any time during the talks. You can post comments or links or type in questions. If you'd like to ask your question live on the video after Donald or Ann have finished speaking, you can wave your hand, and there's a facility for doing that under the list of participants at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And just a reminder that we're making a recording and we're live. So our second speaker will be Anne. And this is Anne at her book launch. It's a lovely banners from Hastings. So we're really looking forward to your talk, Anne. Thank you for joining us. And we will go on. Our first speaker is Donald. I first heard him I was aware of you, Donald, at the International Conscientious Objectors Day ceremony, which we had online for the first time this year, and I was told that you were there. You were one of the participants. You were one of the people logging on, and then we met more in the first Conscience webinar. So it's wonderful that you can join us, and it's a real privilege and opportunity to hear your story. So thank you.
Right. Are you ready for my talk to begin?
I think we are. I've stopped sharing.
Well,
Nice
good
week.
evening, everyone. And thank you, Karen, for your kind introduction. Now, it's 80 years since I had to come to some sort of decision as what I should do about registering at the beginning, when I achieved the age of 18 in World War II. It's a very serious thing to have to consider. It can affect your life. And I'm 95 years old now, and it has affected mine in the decision which I made. So if there were similar circumstances arising, again, unfortunately, that conscription was brought in, I think anyone who decides to, or thinks they would like to become objector should consider it very seriously. It's a very serious decision, and it has to be arrived at with much thought. Now, what I thought before going on to my experiences as a conscientious objector during the war, obviously influences during my younger life must have had some effect on my decision. So I thought it was probably best to, first of all, before telling you about my personal path during the war, to give you an idea of my upbringing. Now, I really have to go back to my father and mother, who were pacifists in the First World War. My father spending over 3 years in prison, much of that time in solitary confinement in terrible conditions, and my mother supporting him, although she was only at that time his girlfriend, throughout the war. Now, when the war ended, World War I ended, of course, he was still in prison, but when he came out, as far as I can see from the dates, he must have almost immediately planned to marry my mother. And of course, they married in 1919, and in 1920, their first son was born. That's my brother, who's 4.5 years older than me, Clifford. And 4.5 years later, I came along in 1924. Now, our home was a very loving, happy home. I remember my young years were as happy as perhaps any child's could be. And so that as far as the education was concerned, we lived in a cotton town near Manchester, Radcliffe, and I went initially to a church school. Well, I think it was a congregational school it was called, until I was 10. Now, what had happened was that before mother and father got, or at least either before or just after mother and father got married, because they'd had so much help from Quakers whilst my father was in prison. In fact, some of the only people who gave much help, they started looking into what Quakers did and who they were. And they joined the Quakers before either my brother or myself were born. So that at that time, if a child was born to a Quaker couple, you became a birthright friend. automatically. That no longer happens. A child has to decide for themselves these days whether they wish to be Quakers or not. But anyway, in other words, I was brought up in a Quaker household. And as I say, I went to primary school first. And at the age of 10, I went to a Quaker boarding school in Yorkshire, Ackworth. It's been established since the mid-18th century, and it had a very good reputation. Now, going at 10, I found it pretty hard going. It's a pretty tough school, but nevertheless, it was a very good one. Now, it was founded on the basis of Quaker Testimonies. Now, there are 4 Quaker Testimonies, which anyone knowing anything about Quakers will have heard of. The first one is simplicity. The second is truth. The third, equality. And the final one, peace, which of course is the one particularly related to my decision, any influence that there may have been. Now, perhaps people don't know too much about Quakers, and I think just a brief, I'll just read a section here which may help people to understand who we are. But first of all, the Quaker Peace Testimony. The Peace Testimony is probably the best known of the Quaker Testimonies, the ones that I've spoke to you about. Its roots lie in the personal experience of the love and power of Christ, which marked the founders of the Quaker movement. They recognized the realities of evil and conflict, but it was contrary to the spirit of Christ to use war and violence as means to deal with them. Quakers also have opposed the principle of conscription since its inception in 1916. It imperils the liberty of the individual conscience, which is the main hope of human progress. And it entrenches more deeply that militarism from which we all desire the world to be freed. Now, you've probably heard that George Fox was the founder of the Quakers back in the 1650s. And in 1651, he made a declaration to Charles II. And this was, I told the Commonwealth Commissioners I lived in the virtue of that life and power that took away the occasion of all wars. I told them I was coming to the covenant of peace, which was before wars and strife were. Now, the Peace Testimony has been a source of inspiration to friends through the centuries, for it points to a way of life which embraces all human relationships. As a society, we've been faithful throughout in maintaining a corporate witness against all war and violence. The whole 360 odd years, or whatever it is now. However, in our personal lives, we have continued to wrestle with the difficulty of finding ways to reconcile our faith with practical ways of living it out in the world. As friends, we face a bewildering array of social and international challenges, which have widened the relevance of the Peace Testimony from the issue of peace and war between states to the problems of tensions and conflict in all their forms. So, that, of course, was one of my great influences, the two being my parents' beliefs and the fact that I was a Quaker, a regular attender as a child, and going to a Quaker school, which kept very fairly to those standards. Now, people might think Quaker ideas are imposed on members, particularly children. That is very, very far from the truth. One of the great things about Quakerism is the complete freedom of thought which one has. As an individual, you're expected to think for yourself, not told what to do. You have to think for yourself, obviously read and study and assess things, read the Bible, learn about Christ's love, message of love and so on. And this was the case at school. Certainly, it was a large school, well, I think 400 or 500 there, boys and girls, not co-educational at the time when I went, it is now, but it was just two completely separate wings in a Georgian building. And I would say that the majority of children there were not Quakers, so from other families who had read about the educational standards which were usually achieved in Quaker schools, several of which exist throughout the country even to this day. And they sent their children, obviously, to try to achieve the best education. And I think the big thing I found at school was that because of this necessity and the ability to think for yourself, you had an opportunity of thinking through things. I went in 1935, and of course that was a period where a few years later you were seeing that the world wasn't really proceeding too well after the termination of the First World War. I've just lost my train of thought for a second. This is a problem. But, oh yes, what I was going to say was that in 1938, some 30 or 40 young Jewish children came to the school, and that was a result of the Kindertransport taking place. Quakers, because the government wasn't really welcoming Jews into the country at that time, Quakers thought there was a problem, particularly for the children, the Jewish children who were in Germany. They thought they should do something about it, as they have done throughout the years on many different occasions. But they decided that they'd approach the German government to see if they could bring some Jewish children out of the country to look after them over here. Now, it was agreed, and of course, I won't go into the whole story, but it was as a result of relief work which Quakers had done after the First World War, helping a German who eventually became one of the German government officers. And having received the care which was given to him after the First World War, he persuaded the German government to allow this train to be run. The condition being that all expenses had to be paid by the Quakers, and a certain sum of money per child had to be paid to the German government. But then it was all arranged, it came over, and as I say, these children that arrived in my school at the time in 1938 were some of the children which was spread between all the Quaker schools to give them a free education. So even at that time, we were quite aware of the problems in the world. We weren't sort of blind to it at all. And of course, these sort of things affect your decisions, you see. We talked to the children and we found it very interesting. There's some very young folks, children as in anywhere in the world, really marvelous people. Well, now, that was 1938. The war started in 1939. I was still at school. About 12 months later, the bombing started. And of course, we used to have planes coming over the school. And whenever the sirens had gone, we had to go, particularly at night time usually, we had to go down into the cellars, into the old cellars in this old building. And when the sirens stopped, said the thing was over, we came up. So as boys, of course, it was quite exciting, this, you see. One evening we were down there and we heard a terrific explosion, and one of them had landed in the grounds of the school. So that caused a lot of interest, of course. Now, I left school in 1941, and I left really before I'd completed the education and got results I hoped for. I hoped to be a doctor, really, going to medicine. Unfortunately, I hadn't taken certain subjects during my earlier years, which were necessary to take medicine. So I had to change my mind on that. And eventually I decided to take ophthalmic optics, optometrists today, ophthalmic opticians in my young days. And so when I left school, I started my study in that subject. But of course, in 1942, I became 18, so I had to register. By this time, I had given things a lot of thought as to what I should do, and I was quite convinced that deciding to register a conscientious objection was the only thing I could do. So that's what I did. And in 1940, I think it was March 43, I was called to the tribunal. Tribunals were set up to decide whether you were really a true conscientious objection or perhaps just trying to get out of it or something. But in my case, it was in Manchester, and it was like a courthouse, really. And they had a judge and 3 other people on the panel. And the judge happened to be Judge Burgess, who you probably don't know anything about, but we heard that, well, some people call him the hanging judge, because of course hanging was occurring at that time, and he had a pretty, not a very good reputation, obviously very strict. And before going, I was a little bit concerned of what, you know, how he was going to deal with me. So anyway, eventually the day came. What happened? You had to make a statement, first of all, write it out, send it up to them, and you could choose to have 2 witnesses. And also you could have 2 people writing in support to say what your character was. But anyway, this is the I don't know if you can see, that is the original document, which I still managed to find some months ago in a drawer. And I'll just read a little bit of the statement that I made at that time. And this was it, in 1943, just an excerpt. Believing as I do that there is something of God in every man, and being convinced that Christ's teaching of love exemplified in his life is the only true way of life, I feel that I cannot take part in the prosecution of war. I endeavour to serve the community to the best of my ability, but I claim the right to act according to the dictates of my conscience. I applied to the two sentences in between, but continue. I applied to be registered unconditionally in the Register of Conscientious Objectors. This is the only registration that I can conscientiously accept, for I feel impelled to make my protest against conscription in all its forms as being a violation of true liberty. Well, I sent that up, and as I say, you were called to the tribunal, and you had to stand there as you would in court, and you had your witnesses on each side of you. And of course, the questions were thrown at you, first of all, by the judge, and then by the other members of the panel. Of course, obviously, there were questions which were trying to catch you out, you know, sort of things to do just to see if you really had thought through what decision you made. Anyway, they had the option, the tribunal has the option of either giving unconditional exemption, conditional exemption, non-combatant corps, or being refused completely. I was given conditional exemption, and I think the condition then was to go into agriculture. Now, I'd gone to the tribunal asking for unconditional exemption, and you are allowed to appeal it about the decision. I appealed to another court, in effect, a different group of people, and they added, I think, hospital work to it. Now, during the year or two before coming up to this time when I had to make a decision, I've been looking into anything that Quakers might have been doing, because I felt the work that they do is invariably of a very good standard and very useful work. So at the time, in fact, the Friends Relief Service has been going since the French wars in the 19th century, and in all the wars since have provided relief service, and it came into action again in World War II. And I'll just read you a note about that. It says, the sort of thing, this is written more recently, but the sort of thing I was reading about the Friends Relief Service at the time I was looking. Following the outbreak of the Second World War, the Friends War Victims Relief Committee was revived for the 5th time in late 1940. For the first 4 years, the entire focus of its work was on domestic relief, working alongside members of the Friends Ambulance Unit and other voluntary bodies in air raid shelters and rest centres set up for the victims of bombing in cities including London, Coventry, Bristol, Southampton, Glasgow, Plymouth, Hull, Tyneside and Merseyside. Between 1940 and 1946, they ran a total of 80 evacuation hostels, mostly for the elderly, adapting Quaker meeting houses, village halls, adult education centres, or any other buildings they could make do with. Some were temporary, others continued for the duration of the war, and even later converted to other use after the war. So before I'd gone to the tribunal, I decided that that's what I'd like to do, to be a service to the community, the best thing to do. I'd experienced the bombing in Manchester, which occurred mostly round about during the Christmas break of 1940. As I say, we lived only a few miles from Manchester, and some of the experiences, just very brief, some of the experiences I had during that, we had to live, actually my parents had a musical instrument business and we lived above the shop, and there were audition rooms which were placed underneath the stairs in the shop itself. And my brother and I, he slept in one audition room, I slept in the other whenever there were any raids on. Now, one evening we heard a terrific noise. So this being actually in the shop, all we needed to do was to go out through the shop, out of the front door into the main street. And it was as light, almost as light as day. So I went back in the house and got a newspaper, took it out, and you could actually read the paper by the lights of the fires which were burning in Manchester. Now, of course, business had to go on, and I was home for Christmas. My father had an order for a piece of sheet music, and he couldn't leave the shop. We hadn't any assistance other than I was helping out in the shop. So he asked me if I'd go into Manchester the following morning to pick this sheet of music up, because someone was giving a concert the following day and had to have it. So I went on the journey to Manchester. There's an electric train, there still is an electric train going from Bury to Manchester, and our town, Radcliffe, is on that line. And I went early, well, I suppose it must be 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning. I went along. And as we approached the station in Manchester, there's a large warehouse, I think it was Baxendale's, a massive warehouse, was completely on fire. And the heat from the fire was so great that you could not sit on the side of the train on which the fire was. So everyone moved over to the other side of the train. Now, when we got to the station, of course, there'd been one of the major bombing attacks during the night. We got out of the station and you've never seen such terrible destruction in all your life. I mean, the streets were, well, buildings blown down, the streets covered in glass and rubble and so on. And I had to go from the station up through town. It's a place called Shoot Hill. Anyone knowing Manchester will know where it is. And they had to go up there, excuse me, had to go up the street, over this glass and rubble and climbing it over and climbing. I thought, now, what a stupid waste of material lives. What is it? War is just dreadful. And this was happening, of course. We weren't only the country, we weren't the only ones getting it. We were doing the same in Germany, except on a much bigger scale. I mean, I think the figure is something like 80,000 British people, civilians, were killed in the raids, and over 800,000 were killed in Germany. In fact, in one town, as many people were killed in one night as what actually occurred in Britain during the whole of the war. So this is what war is. It is just absolutely horrible and should certainly not continue to be used for any purpose. But anyway, that's the feeling I had when I went there. Now, of course, this is going on a long time now, so I'll have to watch the time. So now we'll come to the actual experience of the Friends Relief Service. What happens, equality is one of the testaments of Quakerism, and this applied in the Friends Relief Service. I was the youngest person at the time to be in the service, and everyone, whatever your age, whatever your position, even the actual manager of the whole business got exactly the same amount of money, 11 shillings a week. And that had to go, obviously, plus your keep. Of course, no clothes or anything. We didn't have any uniform or anything. So you had all your travel and everything other than your lodging and food had to come out of that. But what was interesting, everyone had the same. It didn't matter whether you were the senior officer or whatever it was. And it was a most interesting experience. I was a bit of a, you know, I hadn't any qualifications at all at this time. I've been halfway through my course and had to give it up, so I had no qualification. At the other end, there were concert pianists. There was one of the television's leading antique dealers was one. There were magistrates, there were CEOs of firms and so on, people in a much different category to myself, and yet I was treated just the same as all the others. It was fantastic. I couldn't believe it. Anyway, as far as the work was concerned, I was allocated to what was called the Works Party, which had to maintain properties. As I say, there were 80 throughout the country. I was dealing just in the southern counties, from Cornwall to Kent, sort of thing. And I was allocated to that job. And one of the first jobs, after a bit of training, one of the first jobs was in Somerset. One of the Fry's chocolate people, because Fry's, Rowntree's, Cadbury's, they were all Quakers owners. Obviously all the chocolate firms were for some reason. But this was a large house in Somerset, which was catering for elderly couples and elderly people who'd been bombed out of Plymouth. And this first job was being assistant to a qualified electrician who was also a FRS member, because part of the house had to be rewired. Well, I was an assistant. I hadn't done anything. I could put a wire on a plug and so on. That was my maximum ability, I think. But anyway, we had to go up into the loft and obviously on the beams, and my foot slipped, and I put my foot through the ceiling immediately above one of the elderly ladies' dormitories. And of course, there was a bit of a mess, so I went down to see. Now, we had to do anything that was necessary, so I then had to replaster the ceiling, a thing I'd never done in my life, and I hope it's been replastered since, because it wasn't a particular job. At least I covered the hole up. Anyway, then of course you go from there, you spend 2 or 3 weeks at a place like that, and then I might go to, for instance, Petersfield, which is in, obviously was catering for families, mothers and children, from Portsmouth at that time. And there's what looked as if it had been like a Butlins holiday centre, these wooden structures, separate structures where they were being accommodated, and we were having to do some work on it. And an interesting thing about that, and this is, several jobs have been done in between, because this was 1944. And it was June the 5th, beautiful weather at that part of the year. And the young chaps, there were about 8 of us, I think, doing the work there. We decided we'd like to put out, it was so nice, we'd go and sleep out in the field nearby, just taking our sleeping bags and so on and sleep. We did that, went out, slept in the open air, beautiful evening, stars bright, and a lovely spot. And in the middle of the night, about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning possibly, we heard this terrific noise of planes going overhead. And you could just about, because it was June, of course it keeps light fairly well, you could see these planes, and there was circling 20 planes perhaps. They complete a circle, then another circle will form outside that, then another one, and actually 5 circles of planes formed. And obviously the noise was colossal by this time, over our head. And of course we realized something must be going to happen. We didn't know at the time, but it was D-Day, of course. And but there again, I thought, you know, there are all these poor kiddies who've been bombed out of their houses in our country. Where were they going to go and bomb other innocent people on the continent, which did happen, of course. And I thought, well, war is surely not right. I mean, human beings shouldn't be treated like that. And for what? People may ask me questions about that, but I'm so convinced that war is wrong, and it is wrong to kill anyone. And now I think I probably will really have to finish this. I'm going on rather longer. There's so many stories I could tell, but time is limited. I'll just have a quick look. I've got a list of things here, just in case there's something important I've missed. Anyway, the war came to an end, and I got back to, well, more or less normal. I unfortunately met a young lady in 1942, just before being called up. And it was love at first sight, quite obviously, because we were married for 65 years. She passed away about 9 years ago. And we had a marvelous life. But what was great about her, having her as a friend at that time, of course, it was difficult for a girl to be friendly with a conscientious objector, conscious as we were called. You know, there were people didn't bother with them because, you know, they couldn't be very good going with a chap like that, you see. And anyway, throughout the war, although I was away for several years in the south of England and she was up in Manchester, we kept contact, of course, wrote regularly. And she stuck with me. She had been the girlfriend of an RAF boy, an RAF base near where she lived before she joined me. And but having someone like that who supported you and believed in what you were doing was a great thing to have, because you're shunned, of quite often. That's one of the problems of being a conscientious objector. You're not very popular necessarily in those sort of circumstances. And so having someone who stood by you throughout thick and thin, and eventually we got married in 1947, which interestingly, just one final thing, I'll just say, because we felt that several pacifists in our area thought that reconciliation was the thing that was necessary after the war. There was a prisoner of war camp in our town. And I think we formed a group, and I think we were the first group that were allowed into German prisoner of war camps in the country at the time. And we used to visit them, and they offered us coffee. It was terrible. It was ersatz coffee. It wasn't ordinary coffee. It was terrible. You had to drink it because they'd been so kind to make it for you. Anyway, of course, as I say, we were planning to get married in March 1947, and we were still going to the prison camp. And the last day that I was there, one of the men presented me with a present for our wedding. And they'd made a set of table mats out of any piece of wood they could find round about the camp. A lovely set of you know, six small mats and 2 large ones. And presented it to me as a wedding present. And I thought, well, you see, there are lads like ours. They'd been conscripted just the way ours have been conscripted. They didn't necessarily support what their country was doing, but like our lads, they were having to do things which under normal circumstances it wouldn't consider ever thinking of doing, some of the things that they had to do. Anyway, I must finish here, otherwise there's no time for anyone else. So thanks very much for listening to me. I hope you've not found it too boring. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Donald. We'll now open it up for some questions. I've had one question in the chat. Now, if you want to ask a question, you can raise your hand literally, or preferably through the raise a hand button, which I think is on participants, or it could be on chat. Alternatively, you could ask it in the chat box, and I will direct those ones. Yeah, I'll just, where are you? There you are. Yes, and if you want to ask a question, I will unmute you. Got a couple of questions here. The first one from Ian on our EC. Donald, were you willing to go to prison?
Oh, absolutely. Well, you see, I've been brought up knowing what my father had gone through, and it affected him terribly. His conditions were absolutely atrocious at that time. And in fact, he was so affected by it that, as I say, we had the business, and sometimes you got people picking up things from the county, you know, sort of some sort of item and pinching it, you see. And Mother used to say, you should report him to the police, you know. He said, well, I can't do. I think that if I did, it might mean him having to go to prison. I could not send anyone to prison to experience what I'd had to suffer during the war. So, in fact, I wasn't complying to conditions. And of course, technically, if you don't comply, then you can get a sentence of a term of imprisonment. I knew that was so. In fact, what happened, as you can imagine, the job I was involved in was traveling from one town to another, spending a week here, a week there, a couple of weeks somewhere else, you see. And the Minister of Labour, who used to issue the summonses at that time, sent me summonses. And I never actually received them. It looked as though I was trying to get out, but that, it wasn't my fault. What had happened? They sent it to an address which they found you were. Now, they were so slow in sending it off that by the time they'd sent it to another address, sent it to the new address, but I'd moved on to another one, you see. You'd have thought that the thing would be to ask wherever it was sent to just to forward it to me at another address. But no, the system was it had to, if it wasn't delivered, it had to be returned back to where it had been sent from, so that they could reissue it. So in fact, over a period of some 6 or 9 months or something, apparently these summonses that were being sent, which I never received the whole of the war. But that's another interesting story.
Thank you. One more question in the chat here this is from Paul Steele. Donald, do you think it was easier for others to accept you being a CO because you're a Quaker?
Well, that's a difficult question. Of course, thinking about it, you see, people in the town, well, the same, but it was a family business in the centre of town. And because people in the town knew of my father and mother's reputation, and obviously did realise. So I suppose it is possible that I was fortunate in having the benefit of that. It didn't always work, of course. I mean, simply because you were a Quaker was a reason for you to be insulted and so on. So, you know, but I think probably the reputation that Quakers generally have had over the years probably helped me considerably, which my parents didn't have the benefit of course, because they hadn't originally been Quakers, and during the war they weren't, in fact, in the First World War.
Great. We've got another question here from Bob Blizzard. How long after the World War II do you think your decision affected your life?
Well, I think till today, I've been active in the peace movement all my life. I've been to Aldermast and the Burley Atomic Weapons Centre. 12 months ago, I went to the airfield in Anglesey, where the Saudi Arabian pilots are being trained in protest against that. I'm the chairman, and have been for the last 20 years, of the Conway County Peace Group, and still am. And there was a period, obviously, shortly after the war, when going into my studies and having met a young lady, and of course courting and so on, I wasn't active in that field. But I've always been active in some organisation which I hope will be helpful to the community. I mean, I've been in a couple of service organisations in the town since I was in my 20s. In my profession, I was active on the various committees, and eventually became the United Kingdom chairman of the Association of Optical Practitioners, for which I received a Freedom of the City. I've always been interested in, and active in organisations where some benefit can accrue to the community. And I think it's possibly largely a result of my experiences during the war.
But Bob's come back. Did you ever feel disadvantaged by it?
Well, I never looked at it that way, quite honestly. I've always been a fairly optimistic sort of person and always found some benefit in almost any situation I've been in. So I couldn't say I felt disadvantaged. I mean, I lost some friends, of course, which is never a good thing. And but on the other hand, I met a lot of new friends with similar interest to myself. So I just, you know, there's a fair balance. No, I wouldn't say I felt disadvantaged, really. I think a person who wasn't so positive and clear in their views might find it more difficult to face some of the situations that one has to face as a CEO.
Bob says thank you. Have we got any more questions for Donald? I can't see any hands. In which case, shall I hand you back to Karen to introduce Anne?
Thank you very much anyway, everyone. You let me off quite easily. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Donald, for all that you are and all that you've done and all that you've shared with us, all you're continuing to do. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And it was such a pleasure to meet you and Anne, our next speaker, when we had a little practice on Monday. What a pleasure to meet you both. So Anne, I'll hand straight over to you, you wonderful historian and writer. Do share with us a little bit about your book in part of your talk. That'd be wonderful. And the
thank you very much.
Interviews that you conducted with conscientious objectors during the Second World War.
Thank you. Thank you to Conscience for inviting me to speak. And Donald, thank you very much. You are a hard act to follow. Okay. I wish I had known you earlier. You would have certainly had a prominent place in my book. And I think I'd like to say, what I'd like to say is thank you to everybody who's here. And just say who I am and why I wrote. I wrote my book, Conscientious Objectors of the Second World War, which was closely followed by Conscientious Objectors of the First World War. Why I had to write them back to front, as it were, chronologically out of order, only the publishers can tell me, and they didn't. Essentially, I am a non-fiction writer. It's been my day job for at least 40 years or more. Writing non-fiction books for children and for adults, virtually all of them commissioned. And as it turned out, I do specialize quite a lot in women's history, but it so turned out that I seemed to write an awful lot about war. And what I noticed increasingly was that we write, understandably, an awful lot about people's experiences during war. There is very little written about those who took a courageous stand, not, as the Peace Pledge Union would say, to swim with the tide, but for reasons of conscience, to refuse to kill, refuse to engage in the military process. And my parents, war, I think for somebody, I was born in 46, and I think the Second World War dominated a lot of our lives for those of us who were born at about that time. I was fortunate, if you like, my parents, my father was a doctor who served in the RAMC, my mother was a nurse, so that actually they repaired bodies rather than destroyed them, if you like. But nevertheless, I did not grow up in a pacifist household like Donald. Okay, and to a great extent, I sort of accepted the fact that there'd been 6 years of war, and that given, and my heritage is Jewish, or at least on my father's side, given what I learnt about war, I didn't really question its existence. I didn't know anything very much about pacifists, but I did know about Hiroshima, I did know about Nagasaki. And as I grew a bit older, I realized that I myself considered that war was not a justifiable method for resolving conflict. And I think I joined CND when I was about 15. I went on Aldermaston in 63, and the rest is history. Went to Greenham and have, in one way or another, I don't know that I would necessarily, I have to be honest, describe myself as pacifist. But even so, I'm never sure about that. But even so focusing it, I decided that really I would like to write about conscientious objectors. I knew quite a lot about some about First World War conscientious objectors, very little about people like Donald, who'd been conscientious objectors in the Second World War. And it was I loved researching and writing this book. And I would also argue, I mean, those who oppose war are pretty invisible in military or non-military history. Every village, every town has a memorial to those, and rightly so, who died in war. There are very few memorials to those, apart from the stone in Tavistock Square, of course, to those who actually took the equally courageous stand, more so, of standing up for peace. And I thought, and if conscientious objectors are invisible, or have been, I would say that Second World War conscientious objectors are even more invisible than those of the First World War. I mean, that's not surprising. The First World War conscious people like Donald's father, who suffered appallingly, they were the trailblazers. They were the ones who established the right of conscientious objection. So that is the sort of background to why I wrote these books. I was very keen to make my contribution as a writer to that history, if you like. Anyway, talking with Donald on Monday, we decided that I would it's very hard to follow Donald, but so what I'm going to do, what we agreed is I want to widen it a little bit, talk a bit about conscription and talk a little bit about what I encountered in my researches. Nothing beats personal testimony, but I'll just contribute, perhaps flesh out a bit more of Donald's story. First of all, not everybody, conscription was first introduced into Britain during the First World War. What had happened was by December 1915, British casualties numbered well over 500,000. And Haig wanted another 3 million men, at least, to fling into the trenches, into the killing fields. Up to that point, the British Army had operated on a voluntary basis, which is the British tradition. We tend not, other European countries, other countries have established national service and conscription. It wasn't seen as very British. But anyway, in January 1916, a military service bill which was introduced before the war, the war was underway, but initially that it was going to impose conscription on all men aged 18 to 41. There was a lot of opposition to it, but anyway, the bill passed, and effectively it became an act. It was enacted on the 2nd of March, 1916. And what was significant about it, and it's very different to the Second World War, was that every eligible man, initially every unmarried or widowed man who had no dependents aged 19 to 41 was, as of the 2nd of March 1916, and I quote, deemed to have enlisted for general service with the colours, i.e. on the 2nd of March 1916, all eligible men actually became part, they were conscripted straight into the army. And that is actually quite significant, I think, because that's what conscientious objectors had to fight. They were already within the military. This did not happen in the Second World War. Initially, there were 3 grounds for exemption. However, and it's largely due to the work of the Quakers, as Donald had said, but maybe unexpected at such a jingoistic period, in the Act, there was what became known as the Conscience Clause. Okay. And basically, it meant there were 3 other areas for exemption, but under this one, which is what we're interested in, it meant that by law, a man, and it was men at that point, could claim exemption on grounds of conscience. So was born the conscientious objector, the CO, or the conchi, as they became known. And I think it is quite important because, of course, until there's conscription, there is no conscientious objector. A conscientious objector is a legal status, if you like. Clearly, if it's peacetime, you don't need to stand up as a conscientious objector. Anyway, conscription ended in 1919. 20 years later, when the world hadn't got any wiser, conscription was reintroduced in 1939. And initially, it was reintroduced as the Military Training Act in May 1939. That is before war had broken out. And that was Britain's first ever peacetime conscription. Young men aged 20 to 21 had to register at labour exchanges, but actually, and be available to be called up. That was the point. As it happens, events escalated, and so on the 3rd of September 1939, the National Armed Services Act was introduced, which allowed for conscription of men aged 18 to 41. It was subsequently extended in 1949 to men up to the age of 51. Okay, and so really differed. What men had to do, and indeed women, which I'll mention later, was unlike the First World War. And as Donald has described, you registered, okay? That was the process. You weren't automatically in the army, as happened in the First World War. Numbers, okay? During the First World War, around 16,000 men took their stand as conscientious objectors. In fact, the Peace Pledge Union thinks it's much more than that. Due to the research they did in 2018, it is extensive research, but that's the figure I've got. Okay, now during World War II, well over 62,000 men took the decision to register as COs and claim exemption from military service, and 1,000 women, around 1,000 women who, from 1949, they weren't being conscripted into the army, but from 1949, women were being conscripted into war work. It was a form of conscription, and a lot of women, or 1,000 of them, stood up against it. I mean, it's a very small number compared with the numbers who enlisted in the army. Nevertheless, it's a significant number, and it was 3 times the size of those of the First World War. Donald has talked about, you know, who were they all? I think Donald, who were these 63,000 people, if we include women? I think Donald would probably agree that there's no such thing as a typical conscientious objector. From my researches, the Imperial War Museum, if anybody is interested to pursue this, they were sensible enough to record loads and loads. They recorded people who'd experienced the First and Second World Wars, wonderful tapes, but they include some terrific interviews with conscientious objectors. They're all digitized, and if anybody wants to hear the voices, we've heard Donald's. I spent an awful lot of time with cans on my ears, you know. And they included all sorts of people. They included actors, they included lawyers, they included clerks, they included artists, they included musicians. I was fortunate. I travelled around quite a lot. I interviewed in North Wales a woman called Evanui Williams, who was a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and who took a conscientious stand against being conscripted into a particular war work. Her friends and family were extremely unhappy about this, and she felt when she went to register, she was very aware of the looks of distaste on the people in the labour exchange, which is where people went to register in their areas. She was very aware. In fact, the impression I got from women I spoke to was that they actually received more hostility than some of the men. It clearly seemed to shock them. I also was fortunate. I have 3 friends whose fathers were all conscientious objectors living locally. My friend Lorna's father was a man called Fred Vahi, who was a very interesting man. He built his family's home out in Pett Level. There were a lot of conscientious objectors in Sussex. I believe some military person from the First World War bought them some land, and Fred was always scathing about the fact that COs didn't seem to know how to work the land at all. But he could be very scathing. And I also interviewed a man called Eric Farley, who spent 3 months in Wandsworth. He was an absolutist. And a man called Brian Phillips, who was very well known. He was a Quaker. His daughter Sally Phillips, locally, is quite a well-known Quaker. And so there were many, many, many different types. Reasons also varied, as far as I could see. People I spoke to, obviously, Donald's many conscientious objectors took their stand for reasons of faith, religion, but not all. Some were socialists who took a class line. These were imperialist wars. So, tribunals were never as kind to political objectors. I think they found political objection harder to comprehend. And they were not prepared to fire on their colleagues, their class brothers and their sisters. Fred Vahi took his stand. His brother went off to war. Fred didn't. But as a child, and he wrote in his diaries, when he was small, he was haunted by the pictures, the images of men who seemed to be disabled, wearing strange pajamas and being very, very depressed. Later, Fred learnt that these were men who'd survived, come back from the First World War, shell-shocked. And as a child, when he was told this, he questioned what might happen, you know, what sort of unacceptable thing would take place to turn people into these wrecks. And he writes about it in his diaries. As you know, Donald has indicated, men and women came from different places. They had different reasons. They were also, where they drew their line, conscience, I think Donald would agree, is very personal. Some were prepared, willing even, to do alternative service, provided it had some humanitarian basis. Others were not prepared to compromise in any way. Some did not turn up for their tribunals. They did not recognize the system, okay? So there were sort of absolutists, like Fred, for example, who wasn't prepared. He walked into his tribunal, lost his temper, walked out again, and actually, because he was a rather scary man, he was sort of left alone, though the police were and the Home Guard constantly came to the house because they decided that Fred and his wife might be German spies. And all their mail was opened and all sorts of things, but he was left alone. Many had been involved in the Peace Pledge Union. I don't know if Donald was. Quite a few had taken, many I spoke to. I spent a lot of time talking in the Peace Pledge Union and with the archives there, and many had taken Dick Shepherd's Peace Pledge. Though, as a conscientious and absolutist called David Spreckley said, many of those who took the pledge did not stand as conscientious objectors afterwards, and many of those who were conscientious objectors were not necessarily members of the Peace Pledge Union. The Peace Pledge Union and the organisation that somebody called Dennis Hayes belonged to did provide a lot of support. I mean, Donald has talked about, I have figures here which I told Donald I would mention, which I will do. I'm noticing the time. As Donald rightly said, would-be conscientious objectors went to the same registration offices in the Labour Exchange that those registering for military service went to. Some of them found it very daunting. There would be a separate space where, as one person I spoke to, he described himself as he rather forlornly went off to this table while all his mates, he was a bit worried because he'd been at school with some of these boys and he was heading off to one table next to girls' toilets, I think, or the girls' entrance. And having registered, those who wanted to be a conscientious objector were put onto a provisional list. And as Donald points out, they had to write a personal statement and appear in front of a tribunal, which effectively tested their sincerity. I would question whether it is possible to test sincerity. How do you test? Many conscientious objectors say, how on earth do you test sincerity? The Military Act doesn't define conscience either. As Donald said, tribunals had 4 options. And the figures I have, which come from Dennis Hayes, who was part of the Central Bureau for Conscientious Objectors, I think, or Central Council, there were very, very few who received unconditional exemption, 4.7% of the total. Conditional exemption, that is conditional on doing alternative service under civilian control. By far the largest, like Donald, got conditional exemption, and that was 37.9. Those who were sent into the military for non-combatant duties, 27.7%, and those who removed from the CO register altogether and sent straight into the army, it's quite large, 29.7%. Okay, I'm going to give the percentages. I mean, there's lots and there's so much. This is such a big story. One of the things, I won't because there are some questions. I'll wrap it up because Donald has spoken so eloquently. One of the things I would say is it was very clear to me, and conscientious objectors themselves told me, that everybody was treated more fairly than they had been in the First World War. The government had learned its lesson. It learned the men were prepared. They didn't actually have to. They faced the threat of going in front of a firing squad rather than relinquish their stand. And they learned. However, and I mean, I think conscientious objectors, the work they did in humanitarian work was absolutely phenomenal. There was some initiatives that were set up that sort of laid the basis for social work subsequently. But having said that everybody was treated more fairly, there were examples of appalling brutality, most particularly for non-combatants who refused to obey order. You know, they refused orders. And most particularly at a place called Dingledale, which I'm sure Donald will have heard about, which was near Liverpool, where large numbers of conscientious objectors were treated just as badly as COs in the First World War. They were beaten, they were stripped, they had cold water thrown on them, they were kept in solitary confinement. I mean, not the numbers equivalent to the absolutists in the First World War, but nevertheless. And another place where there really was brutality was Ilfracombe training camp near Devon. And the conditions were absolutely shocking. they did hit the press. Letters were smuggled out by COs and friends of COs that found their way to the CBCO, and questions were asked in the House of Commons. It was nothing, the extent was not as bad, but the treatment was every bit as brutal for some of the men who refused to put on their uniforms and who refused. And I know, because just to conclude, I did a book launch for my book, and I sort of lost my nerve, and I wrote to Bruce Kent and asked if he would speak at my launch. And I sent him a copy of my book. And I had a very, very nice email back from him. And he was far too busy to come to Hastings. That's fair enough. I really had to do it myself. But he did say that he thought everything had happened in the First World War. He did not realise, and I think he was quite genuine, he did not realise there was so much to say, and that the story was so big, really big. I believe it's a much neglected story. It needs much more coverage. It was a very different war. One conscientious objector I spoke to said, and I don't know if Donald would agree or disagree, that it was almost, people were more lenient and kinder and more understanding to consciences in the Second World War. But the decision not to fight in the face of fascism and Nazism was a very hard one for decent people who cared just as much about the horrors of what was going on in Germany and Italy and elsewhere and in occupied territories as anybody else. My sense when I finished was that it presented a different test of conscience. For some people, some of the people I spoke to and some of the diaries I read, they knew they couldn't kill. That was out of the question. And it's probably why there were so many more alternativists in the Second World War. There weren't as many absolutists, proportionately. Look, I'll stop there because actually we could still be here tomorrow morning if I carried on. Okay. I hope that was filled out Donald's story a little bit.
Thank you very much, Anne. Thank you so much. And that was really, really informative and really, really interesting. Again, I'd like to remind people, if you want to ask a question, you can outline it in the chat, or you can raise your hand both literally or through the chat function. We have a practical question from Jack Woodruff. What was the name of the CEO who was a member of the Fellowship of Reconciliation? I work for FOR now, and I forgot to write the name down. So could you help Jack?
Oh my God, which one, Jack? There are a lot. There were a lot of COs. Is there a specific? Can you give me any more clues, Jack?
You were talking before, and you said one of the names, and you said
the woman. It was a woman,
yeah,
and her name was Evanui. Ifanwy.
Yeah.
If I thought you meant somebody else. Williams. Evanui Williams. If you want to email me, I can send you what information she gave. You'd be very welcome to email me.
That would be good.
And I can send you some stuff from her, the interview I did with her, if you'd like.
Fantastic. Okay, any other questions? Monica, are you going to write about female COs in particular?
That's a really nice question. That's a good question. I would rather like to, I think. I guess I would like. There are two things actually that I think could have more. There has been some stuff written on women COs, and yes, I would. Thank you. I would like to. Would you like a book on it? Is I think the question. Also, an area that I hadn't realized until I did this book was how big the peace movement, the anti-war movement, was in Britain between the wars. I mean, again, it's relative to everybody else. As today, it is always a small percentage of the overall population. But actually, I was astounded because many of the CEOs who came out of the First World War, I had a quote here, and I can't remember who said it, but I'm going to say, yes, that's right, but I can't find it. Dennis Hayes, who's written extensively about CEOs. Dennis Hayes said it wasn't enough to be just a conscientious objector opposing war. In his view, you had to carry on. When war was over, it was incumbent on you as a CEO to do everything you could to prevent another war from happening. And that was part of the responsibility of a CEO. And it's very clear that after the First World War, many of the CEOs who came out, who were wrecked, many of the absolutists, I mean, they were in a terrible state coming out of prison, but many of them then became involved with, there was the No More War movement, there were various, the Fellowship of Reconciliation. I discovered to my huge pleasure that to a man and wife who took their stand as conscientious objectors locally, they had set up the Hastings Peace Group in 1928. You know, it was extraordinary how I'm fascinated by how much work was going on, to try and encourage international friendship through things like woodcraft and links with the German children's organization. So yes, I think women CEOs need more coverage, much more. And I also think the interwar peace movement would benefit from more coverage.
Thank you.
Is from Monica. Monica, if you have, was your mother a CEO? Gotcha. I'd be very happy to give you my email if you'd like to send me information.
I will happily send you some more information. I hope you can now hear me.
Yes, I can.
No, my mother came to this country in 1938 as a young woman from Austria.
Yeah.
And had to make her own way, and somehow got involved with the Nursery School Association, the Quakers, a wartime nursery, and this wartime toy making workshop, which also had interesting connections with the Fire Brigades Union, who provided the workshop with timber from salvaged from bombed out buildings that my mother and others then turned into toys for the wartime nurseries. And my mother, before she died, wrote down some of her reminiscences, and I can send you quite a lot more information.
Would you like her story? Have you written her? Have you not thought to write her story yourself?
I'm writing bits of it. My mother only died last year.
I'm sorry.
Aged 98.
Yes.
I'm still going through her papers, trying to find out what she's written herself,
yes,
and trying to put together, fit the pieces together. My mother was an artist, not a writer. But she wrote down some of her reminiscences, and I'm finding supplementary material and all manner of interesting connections.
Oh, I'm sure.
And I would be very happy to email and correspond or even Zoom with you about it, because I think it's really interesting stories.
Monica. I'd really love that. I mean, I don't know what you do, Karen or Jonathan. I mean, I am happy to put my email on here, onto the chat thing. I don't know what your policy is on any of that.
If you're happy to do it, then it's up to you. It's
okay.
It's your data.
I know. Oh, that's actually, Jonathan, that's gone to you. It should go to everyone, shouldn't it? Can you circulate it to everyone?
Yeah, I'll copy it and put it to everyone.
Would you copy it and put it out? And then if anybody wants to get in touch with me, they're very welcome to. That's interesting. Brian, you're working to create an opposing war memorial to conscientious objectors. What a lovely thing to do.
Brian's actually literally just this minute asked a question as well.
Ah.
Have you written about, or can you say any more about COs who set up alternative farming communities?
The answer to that is yes. Yes, I have. And in fact, I mean, not a lot, not exclusively, but it is included within my book, particularly a comic called Halton Come Beckering. Do you know? I don't know if you know about it, but I have, because a number of COs, I think what I would, is it Brian who's asked, Brian, do you have personal experience of it?
I'm going to unmute Brian, or ask him to unmute himself.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Anne. Not personal experience of COs in Britain who did that, but I did actually, as it happens, spend some time in jail with a Second World War conscientious objector in the United States who was a member of
that for draft dodging?
Yeah, he was interned during the Second World War.
Yes.
Who's I'm sure passed on by now because that was many years ago that I knew him.
I am listening to you.
He was a member of the Church of the Brethren, a guy called Ralph Hutchinson. Hutchinson.
Yes.
From Western Michigan, and very lovely man. But no, I was just curious about that because I think that that was I have heard it said by others who've been involved with this issue that the alternative communities, were such a positive example, that they were sort of doing their best anyway to become the change that they kind of wanted to see in the world.
I think that's exactly right. It is sort of also the same day. Certainly, a number of conscientious objectors and all pacifists, okay? The one thing I do want to say is not all conscientious objectors were pacifists, but certainly, as you rightly say, I've said that pacifism and the desire to create a cooperative society based on the land did find expression during the Second World War. And there were a number. I know there was one in Norwich, the one I write about, which you can look up, it's Halton, Holton, hyphen, cum, C-U-M, hyphen, Beckering, B-E-C-K-E-R-I-N-G. And it's a very interesting one. Eric Farley, who spent 3 months in Lewis prison, after he came out of prison, he actually did some work there. Also, somebody who made their way there was somebody called, I can never pronounce his surname, but his name, it's Francis Camertz. Does anybody know about him? Now, he was a pacifist and he worked there. His brother was then killed in the RAF. And Francis Camertz, he didn't go to school, but he then joined SOE, the Special Operations Executive, and spent the rest of the war as a secret agent behind enemy lines in occupied territory in France. He was extremely well known. Now, somebody else who has made a documentary on this is because I have, honestly, once I finish writing a book, my memory is not very good. But anyway, yes, Jim Broadbent has made, the actor, he has made a documentary about it because his father was one of the founding members of Halton Come Beckering. Now, I believe the farm is still there, my friend Susanna has told me, but it is no longer a pacifist commune, But that was one of the best known. And another one was the Adelphi Centre, which was set up in Essex and it was co-founded by Max Plowman and John Middleton Murray,
Right.
who was a well-known pacifist. And as I say, there were, I mean, in the end, they did all fail, okay? And they failed for various reasons. Quite often the people who were involved had absolutely no idea what one end of a hoe was from the other, you know. So they, which is the thing that drove Fred Vahi bananas. So it was very clear that conscientious objectors were much happier sitting together talking than they actually were putting the hand to the plough. But even so, they were, I think, quite inspirational attempts at putting their principles into practice. Does that give you any background information you might be able to work with, Brian?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much for that. I've certainly really enjoyed your talk.
And Jonathan, you said, have you, Conches of Halton cum Beckering on 7th of May. It's up on the chat, Brian. Presented by Billy Bragg. That's right. You're
Oh yeah.
God, was it 2000? Was it that long ago? I thought I saw it only yesterday.
Right.
You might even be able to find it, Brian. It may be via an iPlayer or something.
Right. Okay. Thanks very much. I'll look into that.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Any other questions? Oh, Carly Cooper on the chat writes, Cyril Pierce created a register of COs from the First World War, the Peace Register. Is there anything similar for the Second World War?
Yes, there is. Now, and I didn't know about Cyril Pierce's register of COs, the Pierce Register. I'm sorry, I didn't know about that. But Bill Hetherington, and I don't know if he is still with the Peace Pledge Union, the archivist with the Peace Pledge Union, his major work was a register of COs from both the First and Second World War. So the best place to access that sort of information is from the Peace Pledge Union. Bill Hetherington, in my opinion, knew more about conscientious objectors than probably any person on the planet. He was also, he could be quite ferocious, and he worked very closely with me on my book and insisted that he had to read every word before it went anywhere near the publishers. He did not suffer fools very gladly. So I feel reasonably confident that everything in my book is accurate, because if it got past Bill Hetherington, it sort of should be okay. But, oh, he is still archivist. Well, he's the man to talk to. He is the man. Okay.
Any other questions? No. Okay. In which case, Karen, shall I hand back to you? Thank you again, Anne.
Well, thank you very much for asking me.
Thank you, Anne. Oh, amazing. Putting all that context for us and so many examples. Thank you.
I think Hilary has a question. Just let me unmute you, Hilary. Yeah. Have to unmute yourself now.
Sorry, no, I was just clapping.
Okay. Fair enough.
Clapping.
Thanks to everybody who came to this. You know, I'd like to say you've been wrapped, but of course we're all muted anyway.
So I'm just going to share just a couple of slides. So a huge thanks to Anne and Donald and everybody who contributed today. I mean, the discussion, we could go on and on, I think, and the questions just now is fantastic. This is to let you know about our next conscience webinar, Conscientious Objection during the First World War. And we have two speakers, Professor Bibbings from the University of Bristol, talking about her research on conscientious objection during the First World War, giving an overview of that. and David Milner, who used to be on the Executive Committee of Conscience, who'll be speaking about his research on conscientious objectors during the First World War in Dorset. And we've got a link already for registering for the webinar, so that's the 15th of October. And we've got a Conscience Webinars page on the Conscience website, so that's where we'll be putting the next ones in the series. And thank you.